Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. The next 72 hours are going to dictate the course of human history. The major financial exchanges of the world that are crashing know it. The major currencies of the world, minus the US dollar, also acknowledge this reality. This reality that at the nexus of the Russian and Ukraine conflict, at that borderline, that new border which is going to be drawn in the next 72 hours, is going to be a black hole that consumes the rest of the planet. Now, I know that we're all dealing with our own localized issues. We just had one of the worst storms in Canadian history out here on the Atlantic. I know in Florida, they're going to be dealing with a possible record-breaking storm as well. I know that around the world, people are dealing with droughts, water shortages. Increasingly, it's going to be food shortages and all other kinds of localized events. But this is one of those overarching SHDF scenarios that we all need to pay attention to. Now, I don't think that it is going to spiral into a major mutually assured destruction scenario in that global nuclear war is going to ensue within the next week. The potential is there, the likelihood is low. The likelihood, however, of nuclear weapons being used in some capacity, either in an electromagnetic pulse generation form or just in the form of nuclear weapons themselves, the specter of it all, could very well be utilized within the coming weeks for a variety of reasons. We're going to talk about whether or not this is likely to occur, what are the possible scenarios that could ensue after Russia fully annexes this territory. Now, it's important to acknowledge these dates. On September 27th, this referendum for these four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, and Donetsk, the four major regions that Russia is militarily occupying, are going to be completing their referendums. Now, there is a 90% likelihood that the outcome of these referendums is going to be that people vote to become part of Russia. Okay, and on the 28th, bills for their inclusion into the Russian Federation will be submitted to the Duma. Then on the 29th, that could potentially be approved by the Russian Federation. And then, of course, on the 30th or on the 29th, I suppose, they will unofficially be a part of the Russian Federation. Now, what that means, guys, is that if Ukraine continues its offensive thereafter, over that newly drawn borderline that won't be recognized by most of the international community, possibly China will recognize it, and the other, what we view as the Axis, what they view as the Allies, that is going to determine whether or not, Ukraine is going to continue in their offensive. We know that without a doubt, because Zelensky has said that this annexation of territory would preclude any negotiations, meaning that unless Russia fully relinquishes control of these regions, Ukraine is not going to go back to the bargaining table. So there is no way in hell that Ukraine is going to let this go, unless, Zelensky gets the nudge from somebody high up in the US government. It's not going to happen. Now, what that means is that they are technically then, at that point, from the Russian perspective, going to be launching an attack on Russia. Now, have they launched an attack on Russia before? Yes, they have on some of the border towns. They've done some inside job stuff, possible hacks, possible saboteurs deep inside Russia. They've done that. But this could well be a much different story. Now, a lot of people are saying if they attack Russia, that Russia is going to immediately start lobbing nuclear weapons. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. I don't even necessarily think that as the Ukraine continues its offensive, this new annexed territory is becoming officially a part of Russia, unofficially, whatever you want to call it, I don't even think that they're going to react in a immediate sense to this. But we do know that Russia is mobilizing hundreds of thousands. In some cases, some people are speculating that it's almost 1 million troops. So we know the only reason why they would do that, because at this point, you would not need that many troops to defend the current amount of territory that they have. Or at least I don't think. I'm not a military tactician. I deal in the strategic aspect of it all, but I'm assuming that they wouldn't need that, considering all the stuff they have there already. And so I'm assuming that these guys are mobilizing for the likely outcome of what will be an all-out declaration of war on Ukraine. Russia hasn't declared war on Ukraine yet. I know that sounds weird, but it is what it is. They're considering this a special military operation to take these regions, and this is why you have people doing pleasure cruises in Kiev. This is why you can still go there and, you know, buy McDonald's and you know, do stuff, because they haven't started targeting that yet. They very well could, and if you don't think they could, then you've been drinking the Kool-Aid, the Western media Kool-Aid. They absolutely could lay waste to every single major city in Ukraine. The fact that they haven't yet is because they have their own set of laws. We know it's an authoritarian regime. We disagree with the invasion. We disagree with all of that. But you need to understand that there is still a due process that they follow. So once Ukraine stages that or continues that major offensive, they'll have every justification they need then to declare war on Ukraine. But it's not going to happen right away. There's going to be some ultimatums. Either you stop. I'm pretty sure Russia is going to give Ukraine a few opportunities to cease in their offensives. And they've timed this so that the fall rains are going to come, and it's going to be difficult for Ukraine to stage a real meaningful offensive. Now, they will continue to shoot missiles into these territories. That's without a doubt. That is definitely going to happen. But the question is, how will Russia respond? Now, there's a few possible scenarios how they can respond. They can respond by simply waging a conventional war on Ukraine, which of course would require this mass concentration of forces and mobilization. Now, in order to do that, that would take several months before they could bring up all of their active duty military personnel who are going to partake in this, and the reserves and all the rest of the guys. The conscripts are going to be months out. The reserves are a few weeks out. But what could potentially happen, and what a lot of people are suggesting with all the ruminations on nuclear war, there is a distinct possibility that Russia utilizes a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon in order to put the scare into Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has distinctly said that even the threat of using nuclear weapons won't deter us. US has said that this is a red line. But I have to ask myself, why is this a red line? Why would the purely symbolic use of a tactical nuclear warhead, and I understand because they don't want to look weak by not responding to it, but you got to do the math here. If a low-yield tactical nuke, just for the sake of detonating it, maybe they just detonated it in an open field in Ukraine, just to prove a point, you know, and it doesn't, the fallout doesn't, you know, spread too far, and it's super low yield, so it's not very radioactive or anything like that. Maybe they just do that, okay? But the actual damage caused by the nuke is less concern, because the US and NATO are more than willing to see through hundreds of thousands of casualties. Whether it came by nuclear mushroom cloud or otherwise shouldn't really be a factor. You know, you have Jake Sullivan saying that we are not deterred by these nuclear threats. Well, yeah, you absolutely are deterred, which is the reason why you're not in there in the first place. If it wasn't for Russian nuclear weapons, I guarantee you the full force of the US military would be in Ukraine right now, and all of the NATO countries for that matter. Now, they are saying that, well, we've told Russia and the back channels, if they do this, then we're going to do this. And we maintain this policy of strategic ambiguity so that they don't know exactly how we're going to move. Well, a top former CIA official, I think his name is Michael Krutzig or something like that. He came out and he basically said that the most likely scenario for a response from the US, if Russia utilized a nuclear weapon they could even use it in electromagnetic pulse sense. Now, the effects are going to be much different. I'll get back to what he was going to say, but they could use it in a sense where they just detonate a small yield tactical nuke, open field, just to put the fear of God into people. That, of course, would crash the markets. The panic that would ensue worldwide would be something unlike the world has ever seen before, simply by virtue of the fact that nuclear bomb detonated was in the headlines. Mark my words, it would get just the effects of seeing that news headline would be far, far worse than the actual nuclear explosion itself. But what they could also do is detonate an EMP. Now, what that is a high altitude, low yield nuclear weapon, which is tuned to emit a very, very high electromagnetic pulse, which will couple into the power grid, hundreds of thousands of volts, completely destroy the power grid, whatever is in a line of sight. Now, the risk of doing this, and I'm sure they probably have some way of containing it, but the risk of doing this is it has a blowback potential. It has a friendly fire potential, in which they could potentially damage their own territories or their own military by utilizing this type of weapon, because you don't really know exactly how far the effects are going to go, and it can travel to the power grid. And as far as I know, there are certain power grids between Ukraine and Russia that are still somewhat interconnected, or at least within these new territories. So you have to be very careful utilizing a weapon like this. And if you don't do it at a high enough altitude, then the blast radius is going to be bigger and there's going to be more immediate casualties. So the reason why they would likely take this approach over actually detonating a nuke would be to minimize casualties, to still make a statement, but to completely black out Ukraine and the capital, even though they could likely do this with precision strikes on various power plants. So I don't know if they necessarily need to use an EMP, but it would be a good one-shot kill. And it would send a clear message. And then you bring in this million troops that you're amassing to finish the job, while Ukraine's communications infrastructure has been completely destroyed and the power grid has been completely destroyed. Now, I don't think Russians have any intent on, or any, are not convinced, because they can't control all of Ukraine. So that their goal has always been to demilitarize. They know they can't control parts of Ukraine. They can maybe hold down these 4 regions that they have. But going further into Kiev and places like this where the patriotism is way too high, and there would be a constant insurrection, it would have to be martial law, police state 24/7. And I don't think they would want to do that. But what they need to do is demilitarize. So the Russians are hoping that they don't have to play the nuclear card. But the problem is that if Ukraine continues in its offensive, which it appears it is going to, it appears, unless it's all just saber-rattling, unless it's this nuclear brinkmanship, the height of which we've never seen before, is all just a ruse, and, Ukraine is getting ready to make some concessions. We definitely are on the trajectory right now to see the use of some sort of low-yield tactical weapon. Now, like I say, how we respond to it is another story. This Michael Kronig guy says that this is how the United States is likely to respond. The escalation of sanctions and a further isolation of Moscow, which is going to do nothing and is really not even consequential at this point in time. At the same time, equipping Ukraine with more modern military weapons and military reinforcements of Eastern Europe. So what this means is they're going to send over the big guns. I'm not just talking tanks. We're talking potential aircraft, possibly F-35s, things of that nature. Because what appears that this is a testing ground for weapons anyways. So it almost seems like they'd like to put one of those into the fight just to see how well it fared against some of these more advanced Russian missile defense systems. But I guess we'll see how that goes. Now, the most important thing that he predicts will happen is an intensification of ongoing efforts to counter Russian aggression, including a limited conventional strike against Russian forces or the bases from which the nuclear attack was carried out. This would be carried out by United States and NATO, because they would have to do something. Otherwise, they appear weak, and otherwise Putin wins. Then he realizes, well, I can just maybe push the bar a little further. Maybe we can detonate another nuke. Are we at the point yet where Russia needs to use nukes? I don't think so, because I don't think we've seen even a fraction of the full force of the capability of the Russian military. The Russians have been fighting with their hands behind their back, essentially, because of this self-imposed limitation they've put on themselves. Now, we're getting talks of chaos in Russia. Now, what we need to understand with any military draft, just like the one in Vietnam, it's a classic example. The same thing is going to hold true here. You're going to have resistance. You're going to have all kinds of draft dodging. You're going to have whole new movements, anti-establishment movements emerge. And it's hard to parse out what the real sentiment is throughout the population, because there's no doubt, definitely some deep-rooted Russian nationalism that runs all the way back to World War II. Okay, there's a lot of people who understand how these conflicts relate. Now, they may be part of the older generation. The new generation might not fully understand, but there is definitely going to be those patriotic people. And it's very hard, which is why you have to be neutral in your appraisal of the situation, which is why you have to consult with Russian and Western media sources, knowing that both are reporting from their own bias, and then basically connecting a dot in the intersect, and that's where you're going to find the truth. But what you need to know right now is that Sergei Lavrov, okay, has basically said that they do not hesitate to declare their intention not only to inflict a military defeat on our country, but also to destroy Russia. Now, I've often asked myself, why is it that the US just doesn't send, if these HIMARS systems are working so well, and they have so many of them, I believe they have hundreds of these, if not 1,000. Maybe not, maybe that's pushing it, but I know they have a lot more that are currently in Ukraine. Why can't they just send more of these HIMARS systems? What has prevented them from doing this? Is it because they're trying to bleed the Russians dry through a long-winded attritional campaign? Because if it was true, if the HIMARS were as effective as they're saying they were, then simply tripling the amount of them would make the situation FUBAR for Russia. They wouldn't be able to do anything, right? So either they're trying to prolong the war, or it's that they are concerned that the Russians are holding back. They know the Russians are holding back. Okay, this is another possibility, that they maybe they do have the HIMARS right now, but maybe they are worried about their supplies, dwindling before the big war hits. So, yeah, well, I mean, we're definitely in the next 72 hours, obviously, we're going to know that those are now officially Russian territories, and it's only a matter of time from that point. It's not going to happen right away, but it could happen the next day. It could happen the minute after. We just don't know, because Russia tends to take their time with these things. But that could be what causes Russia to declare all-out war in Ukraine. Now, whether or not they utilize conventional or unconventional means after that is unknown. It is unknown, because on the one hand, from their perspective, at this point, I think they're so isolated that they might be thinking to themselves, we got nothing to lose in using a nuclear weapon. We know China has our back. We know Iran has our back now, because Iran is being subverted from the outside. It's clear as day what's going on there. I mean, you have this coming at the same time, this Iranian uprising or whatever it is. Isn't it convenient how that happens right as the Iranian nuclear deal has fallen through, and right as the Iranians are starting to ship more and more of these, what apparently are very effective kamikaze drones to the Russian front lines? They're They're taking out weapons depots. They're taking out heavy equipment. These are very effective. And isn't it surprising that once again, you have this potential uprising. Now, this has been attempted in Iran before, never successfully. It's always been, they always attempt to do this every few years. And I'm just speculating, but I mean, you put two and two together, that has to be what it is. That has to be that there's somebody pulling the strings with that whole movement that is ensuing there. Of course, they have the woman who, you know, was beaten or whatever, and I don't agree with that sort of theocratic society at all. But I'm just saying it is what it is. We got to get the AC on in here. It is hot as hell again, guys. We're looking at possible 30 degrees this week. 30 degrees. It's almost the end of September. I had the soulless soil scientist in today. We're talking about how to grow stuff when SHTF, and very, very insightful video. And one of the problems we encountered this year, it was just too hot, cooked a lot of the plants. So anyways, that's something we're going to factor in moving forward. But even China is preparing for worst case scenarios. You know, there's some news that has come out about Xi, how he was under house arrest. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, guys, stuff like that, like the September 24th thing, we were telling people, ignore that. It's bullshit. If it sounds like bullshit, it probably is. Now, that doesn't mean that where there's smoke, there's fire. Apparently, there was a lot of planes that were rerouted out of that region at the time. I think it probably has more to do with the COVID lockdowns. But I don't think that China is going to be too concerned, especially while they have the U.S. breathing down their neck in Taiwan, if Russia uses a nuke. They might even want to see what the response is going to be. Now, officially, they're going to not necessarily condemn it, but they're going to encourage peaceful resolution. But you're always going to say that, right? So I don't really believe this, you know, when the U.S. says that they're going to respond. I don't believe that the U.S. is going to respond definitely not with a nuclear response if Russia detonates a nuke in Ukraine. They might just detonate a small one, like I said, in the middle of a field somewhere where nobody's going to get hurt, just to prove a point. Now, if they do that, my God, the markets, the panic is going to be wild. It is going to be wild. Like, employee came up to me today. I always keep this in my car now. We don't even have many left, I don't think. I think we're down to like, we had a few thousand and they're gone. This Styrosafe, and he's like, are we getting any more of this? And I'm like, no, the government bought it all. And, you know, he just kind of looked at me funny. And I'm like, yeah, the government has bought all the potassium iodide pills. That doesn't mean they're not going to eventually catch up in demand. Because you know how the government is, they're very inefficient, so they probably just scoop it up whenever they can. But that's very concerning, that there's a very, very real risk of this thing going nuclear. There's a lot of other things in the news today, guys, like food price potential increases. There's a lot more on this story. In terms of peace talks, I think it's pretty much out of the question at this point. I think the likelihood of that is very low. There was some potential prospect for Turkey trying to broker some sort of peace deal or initiating that process once again, but it all comes without preconditions, and both sides have major preconditions that are never going to be agreed upon. So all I will say is just bide your time, because you know, it's only looking escalatory at this point. The next 3 days, I'm saying it's not going to amount to nuclear war right away, but we've entered a whole new level of escalation at that point. And the Russians aren't mobilizing that many troops for no reason. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.